Do you want to be ahead of the game for the latest in arts, music, cuisine, and entertainment across the Middle East's most dynamic capital cities? Al Monitor is proud to launch our City Pulse newsletters, focused exclusively on local news, starting in Riyadh, Dubai, Istanbul, and Doha. Each week, our on-the-ground writers in these cities cover the latest cultural happenings and trends, so you have everything you need to know for the best local experiences. To subscribe for free, go to almonitor.com, that's al-monitor.com, and sign up on our newsletter page.
Welcome to another episode of On the Middle East, where we discuss the big and interesting stories in our region. My name is Amber Zaman, and today I'll be doing a deep dive into the Kurdistan Workers' Party and its decision to end its more than 40-year-long campaign against the Turkish state. My guest is the amazing Aliza Marcus, author of Blood and Belief, the PKK and the Kurdish Fight for Independence. Aliza, who worked for long years as a journalist, understands the PKK like no other, and our conversation may sound obscure to some, but I loved every second of it. So welcome to our program, Aliza. I'm so excited to have you. It's been a long and arduous hunt to get Aliza Marcus on my program.
I have to say, Amber, I'm thrilled that we could do this conversation.
So something quite extraordinary happened on Friday, July the 11th. We saw 30 PKK guerrillas in the mountains of Kurdistan at this cave, sort of cast their weapons inside this giant cauldron and set them on fire. This performance, shall I say, was intended to signal the end of their more than 40-year-long fight against the Turkish military. So my question to you, Aliza, is this the end of the PKK as we know it?
You know what? That is a great question. And I would say no, not yet. It's a little early to write off the PKK as we know it. First of all, when Ocalan called on the PKK at the end of February to disarm and dissolve, his statement was very clear, and the PKK immediately came back and said, yes, we will do that. And then there was a long delay. And clearly that was a point where there were some negotiations going on about, how would the PKK do this? How would this happen? Because it's not so simple. How do you disarm thousands of men and women? How do you get rid of an organization that's been around for, even more than 40 years, even longer than they've been fighting? And, the PKK ultimately did hold its Congress in May, and they did officially dissolve, and they officially announced the end of the war. But they haven't disappeared. I mean, the group still exists. It still exists in form. It still exists in thousands of armed people in the mountains. It still exists through a myriad of directly affiliated and just sort of generally affiliated political, cultural, media organizations, throughout the world. I mean, mainly obviously in Europe, Turkey, even in Iraqi Kurdistan. They have an affiliated group in Syria. They have an affiliated group for Iran. So just saying that this is the end of the PKK hasn't ended the PKK. And certainly, even if you look at their discussions now and what they're saying, they still use the word PKK. So the group still exists. I think the question is for the group, how will they transition to something else? And yes, they want to at some point. I mean, that's what's under discussion. How do you transition to a political, legal movement? But all that remains to be seen. So the group itself is still there. Yes, they've announced the end of their war. But as you pointed out, it was a symbolic gesture they took last week where they burned their weapons. They burned 30 weapons or maybe 35. They've got hundreds, thousands more in the mountains of Iraqi Kurdistan. They can certainly buy more if they need to. So I think what's important here right now is that they've taken a step to say, yes, we want peace. Yes, we are willing to stop fighting. But now what happens next will have to be the subject of negotiations.
That is their position, but then we also heard their imprisoned leader, Abdullah Ocalan, who's the one who told them to, lay down their weapons, end the war, sort of describe what he believes should be the future for this movement. And he seemed to be very dismissive of almost everything that they stood for initially, cultural rights, independence that he gave up on a long time ago. But even autonomy, he seemed to dismiss. I mean, that whole message that we heard on February 27 really was kind of pretty harsh, wasn't it? If you're sitting in the mountains of Kurdistan, having gone there, willing to lay down your life for this cause, to have the leader who you worship say those things. I mean, what was Öcalan actually saying, in your view?
So, yes, looking at that statement initially, it sounded like that was it. He had given up everything. And he was basically saying, accept whatever you can get from the Turkish government. But again, we have to have a little historical context here. In 1999, when Öcalan was on trial, he gave it away as well. He said, we are now, he even at that point even dismissed the fight completely. He said what we really should be focusing on is a democratic Turkey, is our rights within democracy, is strengthening the Turkish democracy. So first of all, this isn't the first time he's gone back and forth on that. Second, I don't have the statement right in front of me, but if you look at what he said, and this is always, I just want to say, this is where Öcalan is really, he's kind of a master of how he speaks. He'll say one thing, but you can also find something else in what he says. That's been a strength of Öcalan. It's been a strength of the PKK as an organization. You can find Kurdish independence in it. You can find autonomy in it. You can find a federation. You can find a democratic confederalism. Whatever it is talking about, you can find that in his statements. And in that statement, yes, he said autonomy hasn't worked. I think federation hasn't worked. Independence hasn't worked. But then he went on to say, but we need our rights. We need, some sort of, not self-rule, but some way of adjudicating or not adjudicating, some way of actually deciding what our rights will be, some way of having our rights. So while he seemed to close it off, the fact is, he also left it open. And I think he does that deliberately. It's clear for the PKK that independence is no longer an option. That we've known for a few decades. The PKK has, Öcalan clearly given that up, even in his later, his ideology as it developed after his capture by Turkey. He clearly was moving away. He moved away from independence completely, focused more on autonomy, some sort of federation. So things are constantly shifting with him. And I think here, again, when you read that statement, then you look at his later statements afterwards, subsequently, it's clear he's leaving it open. So it looks, yes, like he's saying, everything you fought for in the past, we're not fighting for now. But if you look at it again, he's also saying we need to, come up with a new path. We need a new approach. So I think it's not. I think for the PKK, they're able to analyze this and interpret it as they need to.
But they have sort of empowered him to set the agenda, to lay out what needs to happen, what the Turkish government needs to do.
Yes, for sure.
And basically committed to going along with whatever he believes is the right path forward. Is that an accurate description of
Yes,
this?
I would definitely say, look, Öcalan is the leader. You can't have the PKK without Öcalan. Everything is indexed to his leadership. Over the years, the past few years, given that he's been in prison and they haven't been able to have direct contact with him, certainly the PKK has made decisions on its own. But it's always within the framework of Öcalan's general ideology. But what I'm saying here is that Öcalan's ideology, his approach, remains somewhat fluid. And we've seen over the years, since 1999, he'll make one decision. 1999, the war was over. The rebels had to withdraw. Then slowly, as he saw no movement from Turkey in terms of changing, its approach towards Kurdish demands, cultural rights, political rights, and so on, he slowly started to turn back to war and started to encourage the PKK to think again about fighting. So things changed. Then he came up with.
Isn't it extraordinary, Aliza, that he's been in jail for 26 years, that on the one hand, he continues to enjoy this power of the PKK, and on the other, you just talked about him subtly encouraging them to think about war again. How does the Turkish state allow him to even communicate such things? Can you explain the dynamic there? What's going on? It's a perpetual mystery to me, this whole thing about A, how he continues to wield such influence, and B, why the Turkish state has allowed him to do that.
Well, I think that, okay, so those are two questions. Let's go to why did the Turkish state allow him to do that? You know, that was a question that was raised by a lot of people between 2000 and let's say 2006, 2007. And gradually at a certain point, the Turkish government stopped allowing him to communicate. They, cut back on visits by lawyers and they cut back on allowing the conversations to be published. So they did change things. And since then, they really have only allowed Öcalan to speak publicly when they've been involved in negotiations with him. So specifically in 2013 to 2015, once those negotiations broke down and the two sides went back to war, there was no more communication from Öcalan. So right now, obviously, if you're going to look to disarm the PKK and to change the direction and end the war, you need Öcalan to talk to the PKK. So that's allowed now. That makes sense. Why Öcalan has this hold over the group is the subject of my first book, and will also be included in my second book coming out in early 2026. Look, the fact is that Öcalan, he created the PKK, and he created a PKK where he is the leader, the undisputed leader, where his leadership is the only thing that really matters inside the group. And that has helped keep the group united and follow and active and strong because they don't divide, they don't split. They're one group that's focused on one leader and one direction. So they need Öcalan because they need him to help them stay united, and they need his leadership. I mean, they have accepted that he is the one to make the decisions for them.
I would say that they've deliberately fed the cult around.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I would call it a cult. I wouldn't necessarily call it a cult, but they have, it has worked for them. And look, it's not unusual in these type of, armed leftist organizations, right, to have one person who leads it. And I think that for Öcalan too, what we've seen, especially since after he was captured, he did allow, here was a man who prior to his capture had decided every single thing that the PKK did every single day, pretty much. After his capture, he no longer had that control. And there was a point where he said multiple times, look, I can't decide the day to day. You're going to have to decide it now. So he did devolve a certain amount of power to them, but he kept the overall leadership role. And look, and for Turkey, he's the interlocutor. So to the extent that we say and we believe, which I do, that the PKK itself, the leadership, the rebels do want a settlement to this war, do want to see some sort of peaceful agreement. They agree that he's the one who has to do the negotiating.
Well, it's always been argued that one reason and nothing could really move forward because you always had the shadow of the PKK on the one hand, them with their guns looming on the one hand, and then the Turkish military, who for, the longest time ran the country from behind the scenes, also, using this issue to justify their continued intervention in politics by keeping that threat alive. And now that the Turkish military has been defound by Erdogan, and now that the PKK has agreed to lay down its arms, would you say that this will actually, in fact, empower the Kurdish political movement, non-violent political movement inside Turkey, and that going forward, you can actually have real rights emerge as a result of negotiations with Öcalan, of course, in the background, kind of like the father figure, and I would say Erdogan opposite him, sort of overseeing the whole thing. I mean, is this a hopeful moment, really, is my question. Is this a real shift?
I mean, it's definitely a real shift, and there's certainly a lot of hope. I think we're going to have to wait and see. What happens in the fall will be critical because that's when it seems that the Turkish parliament will announce a commission that's supposed to look at, the next steps with the PKK and with negotiations. But in theory, yes, certainly this will empower the legal Kurdish politics inside Turkey. And, the Dem Party is the main interlocutor in the legal political sphere. And I think, we're seeing that already in parliament. We're seeing that already in statements by Turkish politicians. So this is a real opportunity, but obviously the Dem Party can't do it alone. And ultimately, things will depend on both Öcalan and the PKK in Iraqi Kurdistan following through, assuming that they get something, they get what they need from the Turkish government.
Today's transformation of the Middle East is at the center of global geopolitics. Whether you're an analyst, diplomat, executive, or academic, you need the best reporting and analysis to understand what's really happening on the ground and what it means for the world. Al-Monitor is the award-winning independent leader in Middle East news. From Riyadh to Beirut, Abu Dhabi to Doha, and Baghdad to Tehran, our team of over 100 expert journalists report daily on the top stories driving the regional trends. Download our mobile app and subscribe to Al-Monitor to follow what leaders and decision makers are reading every day. Go to almonitor.com, that's AL-MONITOR.com, and use promo code POD25, POD25 for a discount.
But the trouble is that Turkey and the PKK alike have intertwined everything that's happening inside Turkey with what's happening beyond Turkey's borders, especially now in northeast Syria, where a PKK offshoot that is running the show. And I have long argued that at the start of this process, what Turkey held out to the Kurds as a concession was the fact that it had stopped being horrible to the Kurds in northeast Syria, stopped attacking them, destroying their, power plants, and just making life generally miserable for them, killing people, etc., claiming they're PKK, holding that out as the gift, if you will. But then things seem to be rather shaky now in northeast Syria. And if for some reason we see Turkey's ally, the new president of Syria, end up fighting the Kurds there, what does that do to the peace process back in Turkey? That would be pretty bad for Turkey, wouldn't it, actually? Are we, in fact, not in a situation where it's very much in Turkey's interest, and that sounds like a paradox, actually, knowing the past. It's in Turkey's interest to make sure that there is peace between Damascus and the Kurds.
I don't know. You and I have discussed this in the past, and I think that
far less politely than we are now.
Yes, exactly. And I would say that not necessarily. First of all, what happens inside Syria, one can argue, what is the effect on Turkey and to what extent do they feel threatened by this? But focusing more specifically on the Kurdish autonomous region and the SDF and the YPG, Turkey, as you said, had bombed targets it claimed were affiliated with the PKK and so on. And since the start of this process, really, Turkey has halted pretty much its attacks. And this has been a great gain of the peace deal. And there's no question that for Öcalan, this was an important part, right? Because he has, Syria is the one area where the PKK can say it really helped liberate territory.
As our dear friend, common friend Bayar Doski put it, the mother sacrificed herself, the mother of the PKK for the baby, northeast Syria,
Right. Except I wouldn't say they've sacrificed themselves. I think they see this. There hasn't been a clear quid pro quo, at least not that we know of, right? We don't know what really goes on in the backgrounds of many of these negotiations, but it's clear for now that the Kurdish administration there appears safe, that things are calm between them and Turkey, and that's obviously a part of the peace process. But at the same time, Turkey and Öcalan both have other interests, and it has to do with what is the future of the Kurdish issue inside Turkey? And for Öcalan, this has always been critical and it's key.
So would
And
you say that ultimately for him, that's the part that supersedes all else? That for him, what happens in Turkey is the most important issue and could even happen if something good's happening at the expense, perhaps, of Kurdish rights elsewhere.
no, I wouldn't necessarily say that. I think he's balancing and juggling as he goes along with this. And I don't think he's going to prioritize one over the other. I think there are different issues he has at different times. And I think that he's looking, look at it as a chessboard, right? He's looking across, um, and he's making decisions at that time, what is going to be best for each area. But I think and that I don't think he's going to trade off one for another. I think he's going to try to balance it ultimately. And what he's managed now is to get negotiations going related to the Kurds in Turkey, which is something that he's always wanted. I mean, that's what the PKK was founded for ultimately, right? Was, they for their vision of Kurdish rights inside Turkey.
Yes,
And
and for the longest time, of course, Öcalan lived in Syria. He
he
went
lived
there
in
in
Syria. That's where he
79.
went in 1979. He has huge support there. It's incredibly important for him. Obviously, with the ties between, the Kurdish villages on one side of the Turkish border and those on the Syrian side, very close. Everybody's related. There's always been a lot of trade. It's very important to him. But I don't believe that he's trading one off for the other. I think
So
he's
this is
trying
the
to.
thing, the Assad regime invited him, I guess, well, it gave him sanctuary in any case. But the deal was that, you do whatever you want to sort of destabilize Turkey, plan your attacks against Turkey, but you just don't stir up anything here. You direct the focus of my Kurds on Turkey. But I don't think that worked in the end, did it? Because when I talked to people in Syria, they were obviously very organized back in those days when he was living there. He was holding meetings, they were going and listening to him speak, etc. So it wasn't like the Assad regime really had a lid on any of that, that Kurdish nationalism was also, flourishing. Well, at least the Öcalan-led type of Kurdish nationalism or whatever you want to call it, because they don't like that term anymore. It's quite, clear now to all of us that Syria was really very critical, wasn't it, Aliza, for the PKK?
Listen, Syria was without Syria, the PKK probably would never have developed into the group that it is. Öcalan fled there. I just want to point out that when he went there, there are many other Kurdish leaders and Turkish leftist leaders who fled also to Syria. I mean, Syria gave sanctuary to everybody at that time. So Öcalan wasn't the only one. He was the only one, however, who was willing to stay there, cut a deal, and really focus on getting training for his rebel force via the Palestinians. So I mean, he was really committed. And I really not to talk about my book again, but in my first book, I really go into detail and look in detail at who supported him at the time and the decisions he took. And the decisions he took contrary to other Kurdish activists from other groups who came to Syria and who decided not to continue their fight for one reason or another. So yes, Assad made a deal with Öcalan. The deal was you can work here, you can even organize Kurds, but you have to direct them towards the fight in Turkey. And that's what Öcalan did very successfully. So while he was organizing the Kurds, he wasn't talking about Kurdish rights inside Syria. And this, by
But
the
he
way, is
didn't need to ultimately. He was
no, but
basically mobilizing Kurds on the basis of their Kurdish identity. So however much
yes,
you were targeting Turkey initially, I mean, how can we
right.
claim that all of that has not now come home to roost
Well,
in
I mean,
Syria,
yes.
where it's not, I mean, this hasn't come out of thin air.
No, absolutely not. I mean, there was always, but yes, you're right. I mean, it came back. He had them organized. He had them organized for himself. So what's really important is in 2000 after the start of the civil war inside Turkey, when the PKK sent rebel fighters, and when Syrian Kurds returned from the PKK to help mobilize, I mean, they had a ready force already there. But there were other Kurdish groups. I mean, the fact is that one thing Assad did by supporting the PKK and allowing them to organize Kurds, but focusing Kurdish attention on the fight in Turkey, he made it very hard. He gave little room for other Kurdish groups who wanted to focus on Assad and wanted to change the regime. It was very hard for the other Kurdish groups to operate. So this worked for Assad too. Yes, ultimately, thanks to the freedom he gave the PKK to organize there, and Öcalan specifically, he unintentionally built up Kurdish nationalism, a very strong Kurdish nationalism.
Yeah.
But at the same time, he was able to squelch other Kurdish groups that would have worked, against his regime directly. Öcalan, the PKK, never worked directly against the Assad regime in the 1990s, and that was part of
Well,
the
not even
agreement.
after 2011,
Right.
frankly. I mean, they were not friends, obviously, but they were not enemies either. So
Yeah,
it,
and that was a deliberate decision by the PKK, which saw, little reason to take on another enemy when they didn't see allies among the Arab forces inside Syria at the
so
time.
isn't it, in a sense, a critical moment for them now, a watershed moment, as we see the tensions flare up between the new government of Ahmed al-Shara, a former jihadist, uh, and the other minority groups, the Alawites, and now the Druze. I mean, isn't this a moment where the SDF, the Kurdish administration there, asks itself the question, do I do a repeat of 2011 and I just, remain neutral? Or do I see an opportunity here? Because it's very tempting, isn't it, to see an opportunity, especially with the Druze, when you see Israel intervening on their behalf to stop the violence being inflicted on them by government forces, going to the extent of bombing the Ministry of Defense. I mean, actually targeting the building. So, what do you think the calculation in Hasaka and Kamishli, where the Kurdish leadership sits, is right now? And also, Aliza, explain to us this fascination that the Kurds have for Israel and vice versa. But, maybe you
So,
want
I
to
mean,
split
first of all, I
that
would have to, not to get into one of our famous arguments that we have
up.
privately all the time, but I would have to disagree with you that this is an opportunity for the Kurds. Right now what's happening is happening very far away from the Kurdish region. It's in an isolated area. It's happening between a specific population, the Druze, and Shara. Muslim Kobani and the administration in northeast Syria are far away from this. Their area is very safe and secure. They still have American support. They control their territory. What more could they ask for? If anything, this is a period for them to say, look, we are a stable force here. We're helping protect the
So that
North.
is an opportunity then.
Well, I mean, it's an opportunity to keep doing what they're doing. That for
But we
sure.
also know that they can't just keep doing what they're doing because the Americans are getting extremely frustrated. I mean, we heard the US Special Envoy for Syria sort of really go after them really publicly, basically saying, just shut up and get with the program. Otherwise, we're going to pull out. We're not going to be your, he used the word, we're not going to be your babysitters forever.
Mm.
So clearly the status quo is not tenable, but I'm wondering whether what just happened sort of changes that calculus a bit, and that the envoy, for example, also now understands that, none of this is easy. It's not going to be easy for Shara, and that this very tightly centralized system just doesn't work for Syria.
So that's where I'm going to have to defer to you. I can't really comment on what the US is doing. I don't
Oh
really,
God,
I don't
Elisa
really.
deferring to
I
me.
know, I
My
know. That's a
goodness,
little bit,
this is
but
just
what I can say
incredible.
is from the perspective of the Kurdish forces in northeast Syria, when they look across at what's happening inside Syria, to a certain extent, for them, it's not that different from what happened in 2010, 2011, where they decided what was most important for them was to hold on to their territory and to defend it and to figure out a way to work with whatever powers were around them that they needed to make that happen. So that's what I would say is, is going to be their approach right now.
Okay, but I mean, it's clear now that with a new government in Damascus that's been embraced by the Trump administration, the US is much more focused now on building that relationship up, and that the Kurds are kind of out of fashion, if you will.
I wouldn't say that the Kurds are out of fashion. I really wouldn't. I mean, look, Shara hasn't been in power that long. I mean, it's been what, half a year? Seems like much longer given everything that's happening in Syria. But give it time. I mean, the Kurds have always, to use a phrase, they've always played the long game, as it were. And I think we saw that in 2011, 2012. We saw that with Öcalan in 1999, and we're seeing that now. The Kurdish movement, whatever faction it is, however we call it, doesn't make snap decisions generally. I mean, there are some cases where I would contradict myself on that. And I think that they're watching. It's still very early to make a decision on this. What they are focused on is, for the first time, they have a sense of security now in the region vis-a-vis, they're not in direct conflict with Turkey right now. And I think this is an important time. I mean,
So that's actually, I couldn't complete my sentence. I was going to say that, okay, you disagree that they're out of fashion. Fair enough. You're right. Things don't change so fast in Washington either. And the United States Congress has a lot of respect, and yeah, they do love the Kurds where you're sitting. But what I was going to say that, now that there's this peace process ongoing between Turkey and the PKK, and that Syria has been, folded into this northeast Syria, means perhaps that going forward, Turkey can help the northeast reach a deal with Damascus. That Turkey can now be their mentor in that discussion. No, or is that
well, I mean, I certainly listen.
far-fetched?
Well, no, I don't know whether it will happen. I mean, certainly, I'm sure the Kurdish administration would be thrilled if Turkey would help, could help them get what they want, which is, still to maintain a certain autonomy. But I mean, that's all very far away. And what we need to, I think what a lot will depend on, which goes back to something, you had mentioned earlier, is really what happens over the next few months between the PKK
Well, I mean,
and
I was
Turkey.
one of the people who kept saying that there cannot be another Iraqi Kurdistan in Syria. Turkey will never allow it. But I'm beginning to think that Turkey's sort of sat down and figured that maybe that wouldn't be such a terrible thing, and that through its relationship and leverage over the Kurds of Syria, it can achieve much more in its own interest in Syria writ large, no? That the Kurds are, in fact, their natural allies, much as they are in Iraq.
I mean, I don't, again, Amber, and I'm going to leave anything on the Turkish government like that to you, because you really follow it closely and have excellent connections, and I think really understand, very well some of how the Turkish government may act or may not. All I can really say is that, this is a case, I think, where Öcalan, the PKK, Kurdish affiliates throughout the region are open to, being very flexible when it comes to trying to find some sort of, settlement that really leads to a lasting peace between themselves and the Turkish government. We don't know whether that's going to happen, how
Allow
long
me
that
to
will take,
predict a little more to wrap
but
it up. I mean, going back to the men in the mountains and the women in the mountains, I mean, if this process moves forward sort of in a positive way, can you and I expect to have coffee with Cemil Bayık and others in Europe somewhere, in some European capital? What will happen to those guys? What will happen to the big commanders of
right,
the
right.
PKK, like Karayilan, like
Yeah.
Bayık?
So, you know as well that in the 2013, 2015 peace process period, there was a discussion that, European countries would take some of the top leaders, and that would be a way to deal with it because the kind of general understanding is that the lower level PKK rebels would be allowed back to Turkey. There'd be
Right.
some sort of process. But first of all, probably if this process, does conclude positively and they find refuge somewhere, there'll be a huge line of people wanting to meet them for coffee. So we'll have to get in
We'll
line
have to
early.
wait.
I don't know where they would go. I mean, I think also there's an issue that, will European countries want to take them right now? Could they settle in Iraqi Kurdistan? We're talking, I mean, Jamil Bayek must be in
In his
almost
70s.
50. Yeah, early 70s. I mean, Murat Karayalon is younger. Karasu is probably also late 60s. Somebody named Duran Kalkan. I mean, they're all quite old, and I could see a situation where an agreement actually would be made to allow them to stay somehow in Iraqi Kurdistan. I imagine that it would be important for Turkey that they, not be involved in politics going forward or anything like that. But, given their age and so on, I'm wondering if they just wouldn't be allowed to settle there. But will we see a settlement this time? I don't know. It's still, I'm really looking towards the fall to see what happens when Parliament comes back into session and the new discussions really go on. But for now, at least, I do, it's clear the PKK is committed to this ceasefire or to this
Well, I
end of.
mean, I would argue that it's certainly going to keep ticking along until Erdogan has secured his position. Because, I mean, for me, and
Right.
I know
Well,
you don't want to comment on this, that's really what's underpinning this new effort. Erdogan's need to remain in power and to harness Kurdish support for that. And we have elections in 2028, whether he holds early elections before that, together with a constitutional referendum that would allow him to remain in power, I don't know. But this is existential for Erdogan. So I would say that, at least for now, this process will probably continue, which is why I think it must be alarming for him that things might, go south in Syria in ways that he may not even be able to control. Um, but
so I
just
don't know.
final question.
I'm looking the next 4 months. Just give me the
Oh,
next 4 months
wow.
until the
Okay.
fall. And then,
Well,
I don't
that's
know,
why do you say that? You think that things could really blow up and that we
no,
could
no,
be
I don't
back
think
to
that
the
this.
status quo ante of.
No, no, no. On the contrary, I think that in the next 4 months, I think by the fall, that's when this supposed commission, I think, is supposed to come into existence. And we're going to look for the next, what's the next stage. So
Well,
I'm
it's
just looking
clear
at
the
it stage
Kurds
by
need to get
stage.
something. They're not going to go and vote for a new constitution or
That
constitutional
hasn't, yeah, but
changes that don't,
I don't know.
benefit them.
I don't know, Amber. First of all, that hasn't even come up yet. Okay. There's no vote right now in the parliament. So let's just take it. Let's just look at it stage. You have to look at it longer term. I have to look specifically at where the PKK is going. And the next step for them is what happens with this commission. That's what the focus is on for them right now.
Okay, final question before I let you go is Iran. The PEJAK, the Iranian branch of the PKK, has not, disappeared. We didn't hear Öcalan tell them to disappear, nor did he tell the YPG in Syria to disappear. Um, is there a scenario where the PKK just becomes PEJAK full time and we see the next battle being waged in Iran? Because that's the part of Kurdistan that remains sort of untouched, let's say, by and large, at least for the moment. Of course, we know, but in the past, in the 80s, there was huge tumult, and for a brief time, the Kurds were in control. But right now, it's not like that. So, is that a possibility that PKK becomes full-time PEJAK?
There's definitely a possibility that a number of people could leave the PKK and move into PJAK, either as a, sort of as a protective measure, or because they truly, want to go and fight for Iranian Kurds. But PJAK has had, I mean, PJAK is one of many, many Kurdish organizations, demanding Kurdish rights. They've had a sort of de facto ceasefire with Iran since around 2011. They had a good organization there, but it's unclear to me, whether PJAK could really continue its fight once the PKK itself is dissolved. I don't think that PJAK will become the PKK. I don't think anybody's going to allow that, neither the Turkish government nor the Iraqi Kurds. I mean, I don't think they want to see an armed force then just become another armed force. But I could see a situation where you do have a small number of people, especially Iranian Kurds, who would stay as PJAK and continue their fight, and that, having them on the border there might be useful for a number of different reasons for different parties in that region. So that remains to be seen. But the PJAK still has always been a small organization, very much dependent on the PKK. So it's unclear where they're going to go.
Aliza, thank you so much for joining us here today, and look forward to your next book.
I look forward to being on the show to talk about it.
Well, that's it for today. I do hope that those of you who follow the Kurds enjoyed listening to Aliza as much as I did. I cannot wait for her new book to come out. Thanks for tuning in, and catch up with you soon on another episode of On the Middle East.